In this video, we're going to be looking at how to graph a quadratic from intercept form. And notice that it looks different from standard form and from vertex form. And this is probably the least usual way that you're going to be presented a problem. But since I've seen a few teachers who've given y'all some problems like this, and there seems to be a lot of confusion on how to graph it, I wanted to go through and make a video showing you how to do so. So let's look at this first one. So here we have y equals 2 times x minus 1 times x plus 2. Now, notice the 2 is representative of the value a. And then we're going to call this first value that's in this first 0 here, we're going to call it m, and the second one we're going to call it n. Now, the first thing that I do when I get one like this is I typically try to find my zeros, or what we call our x-intercepts, our roots, or solutions. And notice I wrote down all those terms right here. When we talk about a 0, it's really just an x-intercept. And it's also called roots and solutions. So it's going to be the point where that parabola crosses these pink x-axis. So that's the easiest thing to find when it's given in this form, and we call it intercept because it's showing our two intercepts right here, x minus 1 and x plus 2. Now what I need you to remember is that really if we want to find the intercept, we're just going to take this factor right here and we're going to set it equal to 0 and we're going to solve. So I'm going to move this up just a little bit and I'm going to write it down here just to show you what I mean. For instance, the first one that we approach on the left is x minus 1. If I were to take x minus 1 and set it equal to 0, then I would go ahead and solve for x, which means I would have to add 1 because here it's subtracting 1, right? We're using inverse operations. So I'd add 1 to the other side as well. And notice we're left with x is equal to positive 1. So that's going to be one of our zeros. Then I'll go ahead and I'll do it to the next one. So if you notice, the next one we have here is x plus 2. So I'm going to take x plus 2, set it equal to 0, and then I'll go ahead and solve for x, which means I'm going to move the constant value 2 over to the right. That cancels, and then I'm going to go ahead and subtract 2 on this side as well. And 0 minus 2 is just going to be negative 2. Now, I know that there's some of y'all who are sitting there right now looking at this going, well, Mr. H, wouldn't it just be easier to just change the signs on it? If we know all we're going to do is just move it over, just change the sign when you see those two values. And the answer is yes. Whenever you don't have a coefficient for x, that's the easiest way to do it. And the reason I say when you don't have a coefficient for x, but if we would have had like a 4 in front of this x or a 2 in front of this x inside of our parentheses, well then we would end up with a fractional answer. So I would say that if you don't have a coefficient greater than 1 in front of this x, so if it's just x, in other words, go ahead and just change the sign. So just to give you an example what I mean by that, for my m value, I'm just going to change the sign of this value right here that you see representing m, which is negative 1. So m is actually equal to positive 1. And n is equal to negative 2. And what I did below was I showed you how we actually get that answer, right? Why we change that sign, because we're setting it equal to 0. But if you just want a shortcut and you just want to say, hey, I'm just going to change the sign on it, then that's fine too. And you can go ahead and get moving a little faster. Now, here's the thing. Just because we have our m value and our n value, which does represent our zeros, and we can go ahead and write those in, doesn't mean that we can get the AOS immediately from that. There's going to be a process that we have to do. But since we know what our zeros are at this point, let's go ahead and write them in. We know this first one is just positive 1. So I'm going to go ahead and put my parentheses for the first 0. And my x value is positive 1. And we call it a 0 because it's when y is 0. So 1, 0 is going to be my first one. I'm going to come over here, and that means if I start from origin and I go to the right one time, that's 1, 0. So I'm going to put a point right there, and I'm actually going to write right here 1, 0. And underneath it, I'm going to put, this is my first 0. Now we have a second one we found, right? We also found 1 was negative 2, right? In other words, instead of x plus 2, right, we moved that 2 over. That gave us negative 2. We changed that sign. So that second 0 is simply going to be negative 2, 0. And we'll go ahead and label that one over here. So I'll go to origin, and I'm going to go to left 2 times. 1, 2. Put my parentheses. And that's going to be negative 2 and 0. That's our second 0. Okay, so that was real easy, right? Just change the sign on your two factors, and those are your two zeros. But now let's go ahead and use these values for m and n, the positive 1, right, where it crosses here, and the negative 2, where it crosses here. And let's find perfectly in the center of those 2 points so that we can go ahead and get the value for our axis of symmetry. Because once we find the axis of symmetry, it's going to give us the x value of the vertex. So I'm going to go ahead and write right here, x is equal to, we don't know what that is yet, but we're going to find out. And then whatever answer I get for that is going to be the x value that I put right here for my vertex. And then we just got to find our y value, and we're ready to graph the vertex. So let's go ahead and use this formula I gave you. I said m plus n divided by 2 is going to give me the axis of symmetry. So I'm just going to make my fraction bar, and I'm going to substitute my numbers. So m is 1. So 1 plus my n value, which is negative 2. So put in parentheses negative 2. And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to put both of them in parentheses. But we have 1 plus negative 2 divided by 2. And if I do the math, 1 minus 2, or 1 plus negative 2, depending on how you want to look at it, is just going to leave us with a negative 1. And then we're dividing that by 2. And if you look, now we have our answer. It's a fraction. It's negative 1/2. Now, you can leave it as negative 1/2. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm going to go ahead and convert it into a decimal just because I know that we're going to be working with decimals in just a second. It'll make it easier for multiplication. So I'm going to change this to just negative 0.5. But know that you could just leave it negative 1/2 as a fractional value, and that's going to be perfectly fine. So since I know that the axis of symmetry is negative 0.5, I know that my vertex x value is also going to be negative 0.5 because they have that relationship. So let me go ahead and create the axis of symmetry on my graph. Now if I want to find negative 0.5 from origin, I'm going to move over to the halfway mark. Now I say halfway mark, in other words, I'm going to move over halfway in between negative 1 and 0, because in the middle of 0 and negative 1 is negative 0.5. And I'm going to draw my axis of symmetry real quick, my AOS. Alright, and I'm just going to label it real quick. That's my AOS. The next thing I want to do is I want to find the y value. Now the y value, we have some math that we have to do to figure it out. But since we know that the vertex, that its x value is going to be equal to the axis of symmetry, negative 0.5, I can simply take that x value and substitute it in place of x in these factors, and then solve and figure out what the y value is. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to move this up so that we have a little bit more room to work this out. So I'm going to write right here, we have y is equal to 2 times x minus 1 times x plus 2. And now I'm simply going to replace the x with negative 0.5. So if I were to rewrite this, I'd have y is equal to 2 times my x value of negative 0.5 minus 1. And notice I just took the minus 1 from here because it's x minus 1. This is my value of x minus 1. And then times my x value of 0.5, negative 0.5, and then plus 2. Alright, so now we're ready to go ahead. We just got to do this math right here, and we'll know exactly what our y value is for the vertex. Now, if I do negative 0.5 plus negative 1, I'm really just combining them, right? And so I'm adding them together, so it actually becomes negative 1.5. So I'm just going to write that negative 1.5 in parentheses. Still have this 2 over here, and the y equals. We haven't done nothing with it yet. And if I have negative 0.5 plus 2, it's going to leave me with positive 1.5. Now, we need to multiply these two numbers, and I don't know about you, but I find it difficult to multiply side by side like this whenever I have a decimal. So I like to stack them underneath. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring this positive 1.5 down and just write it underneath. Put a little x right there, just showing that I'm multiplying. And you just got to remember your rules of multiplying. So some of the rules that I think about when I get to this point, right, is I want to consider that if I'm multiplying a negative times a positive, I know it's going to give me a negative number. So therefore, once we get through multiplying negative 1.5 times positive 1.5, we'll have a negative answer. And remember, if it was a negative times a negative, that would give you a positive. And every time you multiply a positive times a positive, it always gives you a positive as well. So just keep those multiplication rules in mind as we're doing this. Also note that we have two decimals on here, right? Two decimal places. We have this first number that has one decimal place, and we have the second value we're multiplying that has a second decimal place. So I'm gonna need to move my decimal 2 places to the left once I get my final answer. But as I'm multiplying, you're gonna see that I'm actually going to ignore the decimals as I'm multiplying, so as that I don't get confused. So I have 5 times 5, that gives me 25. So I'll write down the 5, bring over my 2. 5 times 1 gives me 5, and then plus the 2 that was carried over is 7. So that makes that 75. Notice I'm not writing any decimals, I'm just going through the motions of multiplying. Now I am going to go and multiply my second number, so I'm going to put a 0 here because I'm moving over to the next place in order to multiply, and I have 1 times 5 gives me 5, and 1 times 1 gives me 1. And I'm going to go ahead now, and we're going to add this together. So 5 plus 0 gives me 5. 7 plus 5 gives me 12. So 2, carry my 1. 1 plus 1 gives me 2. Now at this point, I have 225 written. I need to go ahead and consider that I had 2 decimal places when I multiplied, right? This had 1 decimal place and this had 1 decimal place. So I need to move my decimal over from the right, which is where it is right now, even though it's not marked. I need to move that over 2 times to the left. 1, 2. So this value actually becomes 2.25. Alright, I'm now going to go ahead and I'm going to finish doing the math here. Remember I said we haven't dealt with this 2 yet. We got to bring this 2 down. So now I'm going to rewrite this. This is now actually 2 times 2.25. And that's what y is going to be equal to. So we're almost finished. And just like before, I don't like doing math side by side. So I'm going to go ahead and take this 2 and just write it underneath what's in the parentheses, and I'm going to multiply it out. 2 times 5 gives me 10. Carry the 1. 2 times 2 gives me 4. Plus 1 is 5. And 2 times 2 is 4. Notice in this case, we had 2 decimal places. Our decimal was over 2 places. 1, 2. So I'm going to move it over. 1, 2. And my final answer is y is equal to negative 4.5. So now that I went ahead and boxed negative 4.5, I'm going to write that in for my vertex, and we're going to graph it. We did all that work just to get this y value. And now let's go ahead and plot the point. So I know my axis of symmetry is already lined up on my x value. So from the x-axis, I'm going to go down 4.5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 0.5, right, is just halfway. So to me, it looks like halfway is about right here. I'm going to double check it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then and a half. All right, I'm going to go ahead and write underneath it. I'm going to write right here, vertex. Because always label it. A lot of your teachers are asking you to label these things as you put them on the graph. So I'm going to put negative 0.5, comma, negative 4.5. You do want to find the y-intercept, because on some of the activities I've seen, not only are they having you find the AOS, the vertex, and the zeros, but your teachers are also wanting you to find the actual y-intercept. And we don't want to graph this wrong and put the y-intercept in the wrong place. Now, the neat thing about the y-intercept, just as you've seen in other videos, it is always going to be when x is 0. So for x, I'm going to go ahead and put a 0 there, and I just got to find the y value. And we're going to do that by substituting this x value into our original formula up here. So I'm going to do that down here. So let me move this back up. This is our work for the y-intercept now. So I'm going to put y-int right here. Work. Because your teachers, of course, they want you to show your work. So I have y is equal to 2 times x minus 1 times x plus 2. And we're going to replace these x's with a 0, because we want to know when x is 0, what is y. So I'm going to put y is equal to 2 times 0 minus 1 times 0 plus 2. Notice I didn't even put the zeros in parentheses because let's face it, right? When you put a 0 in there, it's not going to change anything, right? 0 minus 1 is still going to be minus 1. 0 plus 2 is still going to be just positive 2. And then we have this 2 on the outside that's being multiplied to it. So it don't matter the order in which we multiply. I'm going to start by just multiplying these two that are in parentheses. So negative 1 times 2 gives me negative 2. And I'm going to put that answer in parentheses, bring down this 2. And then now I'm going to multiply this positive 2 to that 2 that's inside the parentheses. So 2 times negative 2 gives me negative 4. And now we have our answer. We know what our y-intercept is. It is going to be negative 4. So I'm going to write that answer up here. So we have 0, negative 4. And let me go ahead and plot that point on the graph. So this is 0 for the x value, and then down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Put a point right there. And put 0, negative 4. And label that as my y-int, short for y-intercept. Now we can go ahead and we can graph this, right? And this is the easy part. It's just a sketch, so it doesn't have to be perfect. But I'm going to go ahead and draw my sketch. There's my line going through my 0 and up. And then this one comes over and goes up through my 0. And that's it. We have found the axis of symmetry, the vertex, the zeros, and the y-intercept, and we have graphed it.